This UCSD TV program is a presentation of University of California Television for educational and non-commercial use only.
Good evening. Welcome to the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice, and I welcome everyone in this room and in our overflow rooms. I'd like to acknowledge Dean William Headley from the School of Peace Studies and to extend a special thank you to all of you who are members of the Leadership Circle who make so many of our projects for the Institute for Peace and Justice possible, from WorldLink to the Women Peacemakers to Nepal to West Africa, etc. The Joan B. Kroc Distinguished Lecture Series is dedicated to exploring new knowledge about how to prevent violent conflict. In past years, we've explored about how human rights, international law, and environment are playing a role. And this year, we focused on development and conflict prevention. Conventional thinking might suggest that, well, this should be discussed by economists, or others in this room might think, oh no, that's a political science this issue. Or international IR, that's their territory. Well, yes, it's true, all of those are true. Development is everyone's business. But here tonight we want to look particularly at development as it pertains to peace, as a tool for building stable societies where inequities, where social exclusion, which we all face who work in this field, doesn't leave such a violent path behind it, and where the power of the purse is also doesn't leave children starving in one way or other kinds of conflicts. With each distinguished lecture series, we're reminded that there is no single solution, no development template that can be forced into every country or community. We need multiple solutions that are created in solidarity with those communities to meet their very specific needs and to deal with their structural deficiencies at all levels. And I think that tonight's presentation will contribute to the development, our toolbox, as we like to call them, for building or rebuilding societies, and societies where conflict is really the exception, not the rule, and where the whole of community that many of you hear us talk about here all the time is engaged. So with that, I'd like to introduce Topher, who has consulted for various organizations, including the World Bank and International Rescue Committee, and on private sector development, urban economies, and public finance, and post-war in developing countries, to introduce tonight's speaker. Welcome, and Topher, wherever you are.
Thanks very much, Dee. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure to spend a bit of time with tonight's speaker as he's moved around campus today, meeting with students and faculty and media. He's actually been a real trooper. Just keeping up with him, I look a little bit worse for wear, and he's still dapper, cogent, and seemingly going strong, so that's great. Ray Offenheiser's biography is in your program, so instead of his CV, I'd like to focus on the tremendous resonance that Mr. Offenheiser's work, his life's work really, has with the mission and goals of the Kroc School of Peace Studies here at USD. In his capacity as president of Oxfam America for the past 13 years, Mr. Offenheiser has overseen that organization's tremendous growth and transition from a more strictly program-oriented humanitarian relief organization to a rights-based development and advocacy organization with great visibility and influence. Moreover, Mr. Offenheiser, a Peace Studies undergraduate minor at Notre Dame, by the way, so Peace Studies students here take note, is acutely aware of the intimate link between development and peace building. In fact, Mr. Offenheiser was just yesterday recounting to me and a few others what sounded like a harrowing experience of an bomb attack in Lima, Peru, carried out by the Sendero Luminoso, or Maoist Shining Path rebels. Ironically enough, while working on an agricultural development program there, since the Shining Path arguably grew out of a frustration over rural-urban development disparities. In any case, many of the countries in which Oxfam now operates are affected by conflicts, whether violent or otherwise. And Oxfam America therefore sees equitable development as entailing the strengthening of civil society, providing the channels for conflicts to resolve in non-conflict or in non-violent, more constructive ways. So you can see that Mr. Offenheiser's career as a development professional echoes the 4 major specialization areas that we here at the Kroc School have identified in our master's program, that is development, human rights, human security, and conflict resolution. In addition, Oxfam's intellectual organizational culture and its willingness to wrestle with many of the big questions, the larger policy questions, even as it engages on the ground level programmatically, echoes the Kroc School's own mandate to both study and make peace, to produce graduates who are reflective practitioners, but who are also, and also practicing scholars. So we are honored to be able to host just such a role model of reflective practice here this evening. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Mr. Ray Offenheiser.
Well, thank you, Dee, for that warm welcome, and I'd like to also thank Topher for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be here tonight with you here at the University of San Diego, in no small part to honor the legacy of Joan, the philanthropist and activist Joan Kroc, in whose name this wonderful center is named and dedicated. I didn't know Joan personally, and learning about her as I have over the last day or so, I'm fairly certain that we probably would have become fast friends. For one thing, I think it's probably fair to say we share a common passion. As Topher said, I was one of the first graduates of the Kellogg Peace Studies program at the University of Notre Dame, which was founded by its president at the time, Father Theodore Hesburgh, during the height of the campus turmoil over the Vietnam War. In the mid-'80s, Joan heard Reverend Hesburgh, a former member of the International Atomic Energy Agency, speak out against the dangers of nuclear proliferation, and shortly thereafter gave $6 million to establish an institute dedicated to the study of peace and conflict resolution at the University of Notre Dame. And then she gave another $6 million, and then another $5 million, and finally a $50 million gift, the single largest gift that Notre Dame had ever received to that point. When she passed away in 2003, a Washington Post tribute to Joan recalled how she liked to describe herself as a maverick salvationist. At the time, her gift of $1.5 billion to the Salvation Army was the largest philanthropic donation in American history. The sheer size of that gift, and others, the scale of her philanthropy, is what she is often remembered for. But the style of her philanthropy had an equally large impact, and one that I especially appreciate. Some 20th century philanthropists set up foundations. Joan thought that was too much paperwork. She preferred to make targeted, generous gifts, without formality and without fanfare, to organizations she believed could make a difference. Hence her gift to establish this institute here at the University of San Diego. In this way, as the Post noted, Joan was not only a maverick salvationist, but also a maverick philanthropist. Oxfam, the organization I work for, embodies a similar maverick spirit. It characterizes our work all over the world. As an NGO that champions poverty alleviation and human rights, we try to bring the voices of the poor to tables where decisions are made. This has been part of our heritage since our very founding by a group of Oxford University scholars, Quakers, and humanitarians during the darkest days of World War II. These citizens of conscience formed a coalition to lobby the Allied High Command to assist Greek refugees whose food and fuel had been confiscated by the Nazi army, and who as a consequence faced starvation during the winter of 1942. Eventually, Oxfam convinced the British and US governments to permit and facilitate humanitarian shipments to Greece through a wartime embargo that enabled Oxfam to feed and clothe the abandoned refugees. So today, almost 60 years later, there are Oxfam international affiliates in 14 different countries. Together, we spend almost $900 million a year in some 110 countries, supporting the work of some 4,000 indigenous not-for-profit organizations. In practice, this means that we have 400 staff in the refugee camps of Darfur providing water, sanitation facilities, and food. It means that we are on the front line, we are frontline responders to natural disasters like the Asian tsunami, Katrina and Rita hurricanes, and the recent earthquake in Haiti. It means that we work with organizations around the world that seek to address problems of poverty and injustice through programs of agricultural production, public health, microfinance, and human rights. It means we conduct public education and consciousness raising through schools, churches, and community groups across the United States. We don't consider this charity work. We see it as empowering people, communities, and nations to undertake transformative social change that hopefully will positively affect the lives of millions of people. And while that may sound a little ambitious, who would have thought when a little drive-through hamburger joint first opened in San Bernardino 60 years ago that one day you could buy a Big Mac 9,000 miles away in Kuala Lumpur, Riga, Latvia, or Lahore, Pakistan? Or more to the point, who would have thought that the proceeds from that little fast food joint could one day finance the study and pursuit of social justice? Would you like a little side of peace and justice with that order? In doing this work, I'm often reminded of the wonderful Flannery O'Connor quote, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you odd." I've spent my entire professional career being odd, looking as Joan did for a better way to connect the dots on behalf of the common good. I grew up in the segregated South during the early years of the Civil Rights Movement. After college, I worked with youth gangs in tough inner-city neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Then I spent 6 months milking cows on a poor Israeli kibbutz, where I learned a lot about Israel's birth, the Palestinians' plight, and what it takes to make a desert bloom. This led me to a graduate program in international agriculture at Cornell University during the peak of the Green Revolution, where I could combine an intellectual interest in social change and hunger with a practical program of study in the agricultural sciences. If anyone here wants to talk about raising cattle in the tropics, I'm your guy. It wasn't in the introduction. I went on to serve at Save the Children, the Inter-American Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Working in Brazil and Chile during their democratic transitions, I saw firsthand the hunger for democracy and the power citizens possess to force even the most powerful military governments to yield to their wishes. In Bangladesh, I worked closely with Mohammed Yunus, who is a good friend today and a partner in spreading his Nobel Prize-winning work on microcredit to developing nations around the globe. I've been privileged to live the values I learned from my Catholic high school and college alma maters, and I've loved every minute of the work. But I'm also reminded every day how much there remains to be done. So it's wonderful to be here with all of you to talk about a 21st century vision for U.S. foreign assistance. In the time we have together tonight, I want to cover 3 basic themes. First, I want to share Oxfam's perspective on poverty. Next, why we think our current aid system is broken. And finally, what we think America must do to make it work, and work for good. So let's start with poverty. Most people have asked, would define poverty as a lack of resources. But it's clear in our world today that we're not necessarily lacking in resources. In fact, we have more resources, more growth, and more development than ever before. In the midst of the economic crisis of 2008, The Economist published a rather contrarian article noting several trend lines with respect to global poverty. For example, in the past 25 years, they wrote 420 million people in China have escaped extreme poverty thanks to the country's explosive growth. Child mortality worldwide has declined by 25% since 1990. In Southeast Asia, twice as many people now have access to clean drinking water. And while this past decade was economically disastrous for America and the West, it was a time of surging economic growth for the world's poor. Today, half the world's poor live in nations whose economies are growing at 7% or more each year, a rate of expansion at which these economies will effectively double in size every 10 years. The result of this growth is equally impressive. The proportion of extremely poor people in the developing world was almost halved between 1990 and 2004, from 31% to 19%. So while significant, most of this growth, we must acknowledge, has come in China and India, while African nations have fallen behind. So despite this enormous progress, 2 billion people today are still scraping by on less than $2 a day. 850 million people cannot get a glass of clean water. 1 billion people are chronically hungry. And every minute we spend together tonight, a woman will die in childbirth, and 20 children under the age of 5 will die of malnutrition and disease simply because they are poor. I often cite these numbers, but in the aggregate, they can be a bit overwhelming, a bit bewildering. So let's try to put them in some perspective. Imagine that this room is a microcosm of humanity. There are probably about 300 of us present here tonight in the room. And let me see, there are probably 10 of us who would be Americans, 12 of us who would be Europeans, and 30 of us are starving. 36 of us are between the ages of 15 and 24, but only 9 are getting a college education. Among those of us who are adults, 1 in 4 women cannot read, and overall, 78 of us have no access to sanitation. So looking around at this virtual globe, I think we'd have to agree that it's clearly unjust. Resources are distributed unequally, opportunity is distributed unequally, prosperity is distributed unequally. This is how Oxfam sees the world. Poverty to us is not the absence of resources, and it is certainly not the absence of ingenuity or hard work on the part of the poor. Poverty to us is about the presence of injustice, the presence of social exclusion, the presence of systemic frameworks and practices that trap the poor at the bottom of the ladder. And it's about the lack of access to those opportunities and services that would allow them to break the cycle of poverty. Very often, governments have the money to provide public goods to wealthy and middle-class citizens, but they don't necessarily invest those funds in ways that advantage the broad population. Onerous credit systems prevent the poor from borrowing to start a business or saving for a rainy day. The poor are excluded from education because school fees are often too high, or because there are no schools in rural areas, or for a reason as simple as that there are no toilets for girls. Health care for the poor is grossly underfunded or privatized, excluding the most vulnerable and subjecting them to otherwise preventable disease. Add this all up and you find that poverty equals powerlessness. And the only way to address the root of poverty, therefore, is to empower. And that's what Oxfam seeks to do. We work directly with poor communities to address the barriers that exclude them from opportunity and access, and support them to change the unjust systems that are holding them back. We also work in Washington to end those U.S. policies that have a negative impact on poor countries, and to strengthen those U.S. policies that could do the most to support poor countries. Some might say it's a futile endeavor, that the poor will always be with us. And certainly there are times when we feel like David against an army of Goliaths. But Oxfam believes that poverty is not a preordained human condition, but rather a human invention. And therefore we have both a moral responsibility and the practical ability to eradicate it. We also believe that prioritizing poverty alleviation is more than just a matter of conscience. It's actually a matter of global security. The bottom billion, who struggle for survival every single day, are a vulnerable mass that can be easily swept into conflict, mass migration, or political upheaval, rapidly destabilizing entire regions of the world. And it's true that today leaders in our security and intelligence establishment have actually recognized this. So that's why the U.S. development assistance, the topic I want to talk about tonight, is so important. The stakes are incredibly high. And when U.S. foreign assistance is used to fight poverty effectively, it builds a safer, more prosperous world for everyone, even as it bolsters our standing as Americans and our moral authority around the world. When, however, aid is done poorly, it fails to deliver any lasting results. It wastes precious resources, and it undermines American leadership and values. Even worse, it can erode the trust poor people have in their own governments. It can perpetuate systems that contribute to poverty in the first place, and it can further destabilize the developing world. I'm sorry to say that today, U.S. aid is far from reaching its true potential. For all our good intentions, our government persists in counterproductive behaviors that serve American taxpayers poorly, and too often fail to serve the poor. To boil it down, I'd like to say our system suffers from 4 key deficiencies. It is outdated, it is incoherent, it is more directive than collaborative, and it emphasizes the wrong priorities to the detriment of poverty alleviation abroad and our national security here at home. So in the spirit of the TV show Mad Men, I'd like to pause for just a moment and show you a brief video that helps illustrate what I'm going to talk about. It was put together by one of Oxfam's partners, the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. And we're just going to stop for a second and show it to you, and then we'll resume.
Today, signing the Foreign Assistance Act. It provides military assistance to countries which are on the rim of the communist world and under direct attack.
How can foreign assistance policy written in 1961 address the issues of today? It can't. Tell the next president that a Foreign Assistance Act from the 1960s just won't do for the 21st century.
I think it's probably fair to say that most Americans have no idea that our foreign assistance is still governed by a law that is older than many of you here in the room. But can you imagine trying to find your way around in today's world with a map that was drawn in 1961? That's effectively what our development strategy today amounts to. We're charting our course with a guide that was crafted almost a century ago. It's like asking today's University of San Diego students to research and write a term paper with a card catalog, a stack of index cards, and a manual Smith Corona typewriter. And yet, even if our tools here were state-of-the-art, the fact is that the Foreign Assistance Act has failed to achieve even its original intent. In 1961, President Kennedy hoped that this law would streamline and rationalize our aid. As he said at the time, and I quote, "No objective supporter of foreign aid can be satisfied with the existing program. Actually, a multiplicity of programs, bureaucratically fragmented, awkward, and slow. Its administration is diffused over a haphazard, irrational structure, covering at least 4 departments and several other agencies. The program is based on a series of legislative measures and administrative procedures conceived at different times and for different purposes, many of them now obsolete and inconsistent and unduly rigid, and thus unsuited for our present needs and purposes." Kennedy took action to address this problem in 1961. He created a single, strong agency that unified all development assistance with separate authorities and budget and a complementary but distinct role from the U.S. Department of State. Unfortunately, the problem President Kennedy hoped to fix in 1961 has gotten even worse. Today, the Foreign Assistance Act lists 140 different goals and priorities, 400 different directives, and these directives are executed by at least 12 departments of the U.S. government, 25 agencies, and some 60 government offices. This tangled mess confuses rather than guides our aid implementation. Let's just take Afghanistan for a moment as one particular example, and perhaps the most important development arena for U.S. foreign policy. With at least 8 different U.S. government agencies on the ground, U.S. military, political, and development efforts are coordinated only when officials make a special effort to talk to one another. When they don't, and in truth they often don't, they work at cross purposes. They burden local officials with too many meetings, they waste taxpayers' money, and fail to keep our promises to the Afghan people. USAID is supposed to lead our development in Afghanistan, yet it is asked to manage a billion-dollar budget, or billion-dollar budgets, with a skeletal, high-turnover staff. Instead of deepening their knowledge of the culture, politics, language, and priorities of Afghanis, USAID staff has time only to just shovel out the money. So it's little surprise, then, that over 50% of U.S. aid funding in Afghanistan goes to 5 American for-profit contractors, who in turn spend a significant portion of that money on U.S. consultants. In the meantime, we provide only limited support to the Afghan government itself to demonstrate to the Afghan people that it can effectively and legitimately lead the nation. Granted, Afghanistan is a war zone, rife with logistical, political, and social challenges. Unfortunately, our aid policies are often counterproductive, even in relatively stable nations. Let's take Bangladesh, for example, a country where 7 out of every 100 children still die before their 5th birthday. We give $80 million per year in foreign assistance to Bangladesh. And while that may sound like a lot, it's about 1/10 of what Americans were expected to spend on Valentine's Day cards this year. At the same time, we charge the Bangladeshi government $500 million in tariffs for products that Bangladeshis produce for export. That's 40% more than we charge France, despite the fact that we import more than 12 times as much in dollar terms from France. Our failure to think strategically about development within our own government means we're constantly pushing a metaphorical boulder up a mountain of our own making. Contrast the lack of coherence in this context with our obsessive control in other areas. In Mozambique, for example, a study by Senator Richard Lugar found that 150 U.S. aid staff spent more than 600 person days producing reports on their work. 600 days that they could actually have spent doing that work. They produced reports on program audits, reports on earmarks, reports on financial integrity. They even produced something called, believe it or not, a report on reports. And soon they're probably going to need a report on that one as well. And a sad counterpart to our micromanagement of aid workers is our penchant for imposing congressional earmarks that often speak more to our own priorities than those of the people we're trying to help. Oxfam has seen cases where U.S. aid workers were forced to build schools when what the country really needed was teachers for the classrooms it already had, or cases where U.S. congressional pet projects trumped local environmental priorities. While Kenya, for example, was reeling from a governance crisis that destabilized most of East Africa, 85 to 90% of our assistance to Kenya was earmarked for HIV/AIDS treatment and prevention. This is certainly HIV/AIDS undoubtedly is an important priority, to be sure, but how can you effectively deliver health services in a country where ethnic violence has broken out? Hundreds of people have been killed in the streets and hundreds of thousands of more have been displaced by the conflict. So having our funding locked into a specific use certainly reduces its impact. It's about as sensible as earmarking 90% of San Diego's disaster relief funds for flood control. Yes, it's a problem, possibly, but not the only one or the most strategic problem you face here locally. Finally, and especially over this last decade, the aim of our foreign assistance has been skewed. In an age when our nation is preoccupied with combating fundamentalism and terrorism, fighting poverty has become subordinated to those goals, instead of being integral to them. The security establishment in Washington recognizes that persistent poverty can alienate populations from states, increase the risk of civil conflict, and erode weak states' capacity to govern. Secretary Gates has been particularly eloquent on this point. And in the post-Cold War world, we also understand that America's greatest security threats will come not from strong states, but from failing ones. And that's why policymakers and analysts increasingly call for smart power, which means combining the hard power of the U.S. military with the tools in our soft power arsenal. In the parlance of Washington, this new comprehensive approach to security threats is called the 3Ds, which stands for defense, diplomacy, and development. But right now, the 3 legs of the security stool are woefully lopsided. Of the total outlays for national security in 2007, 95% was for defense, and just 3.5% was for development. 1 of every $3 of U.S. foreign assistance today goes to countries that are political allies in the war on terror or the war on drugs. Instead of fighting poverty where it exists, we're fighting it where the U.S. government is, well, already fighting. Meanwhile, just 1 of every $16 of development aid is actually spent on the world's 10 poorest countries. The entirety of all of our aid to sub-Saharan Africa, I'm going to repeat that, the entirety of all of our aid to sub-Saharan Africa between 1961 and 2005 amounted to only about half of what we spent for military operations and reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2007 alone. And when Oxfam sees the Department of Defense playing a greater role in setting foreign aid priorities while our civilian agencies suffer from depleted capacity and resources in the field, we genuinely believe that our short-term tactical concerns are trumping our long-term strategic interests in poverty alleviation. When we see the military using foreign aid as a force multiplier and diplomats using it to persuade a foreign government to cooperate with us politically, Experience in the field tells us that we cannot expect poverty alleviation to result. But Oxfam's experience also tells us that whether our nation fights global poverty for moral reasons or to improve its own security, truly effective foreign assistance will only happen when we are fighting poverty for its own sake. So that's why Oxfam is calling for a more intelligent balance among the 3 Ds. We believe that it is through reducing global poverty that we will eventually counter the threat of instability. And it is through improving poor people's lives that we will earn their trust and build the diplomatic partnerships we need to secure our national interest. In other words, fighting global poverty must be development's singular priority, singular goal, and singular focus. It must be a U.S. foreign policy objective in and of itself, an objective that is not subservient, but essential to our security and other national interests. And if we're going to do this work coherently, consistently, and collaboratively, we need a national strategy for global development that defines that singular mission, establishes the principles to help to achieve it, and coordinates our government to get it done. This is the starting point. The good news is that a consensus has emerged on the need for foreign assistance reform. Voices across the spectrum in Washington are calling for a renewed approach, from the Bipartisan Help Commission launched by President Bush to scholars, think tanks, and practitioners, to members of Congress like California's own Howard Berman, to President Obama himself. For those of you in the audience unfamiliar with the pace of consensus building in the development space in Washington, this is akin to a blue moon, pigs flying, and the Padres winning the World Series, all on the same day. Was that a cruel joke about the Padres? I'm sorry. The degree of agreement around the need for reform and the types of reform needed is unprecedented. And therefore, this is, in our minds, a moment of tremendous opportunity for those of us who care deeply about human rights and social justice. From Oxfam's perspective, a new strategy for development should start with a simple recognition that the answer to global poverty lies with the people of the developing world and their governments. We need to help governments and citizens find ways to finance and meet their own development needs. The end goal of our foreign aid policy, after all, should be to render itself unnecessary. But to get there, we need to deliver aid in a way that strengthens rather than undermines the relationship between citizens and governments in poor countries. To that end, we believe that a national strategy for global development should be informed by 3 important principles. The first principle is that our national strategy should give poor people what they actually need. Now, this seems like a rather self-evident concept, but as I noted earlier, we often fail to stop and listen to the people we are trying to help. Let me give an example. Several years ago, $30 million in U.S. aid was appropriated to deliver roofing timbers to people in Afghanistan's Central Highlands. And according to an NGO on the ground, the agency in Geneva meant to oversee the project took 20% of the $30 million for administrative costs, which then subcontracted to another non-governmental organization in Washington, D.C. that took another 20%, which in turn subcontracted to an Afghan NGO that took another 20%. Then they paid money to a trucking company in Iran to haul the timber. Once the timber arrived, it was found to be of no use as roofing timber to the villagers, for the villagers. In fact, it proved to be too heavy for the mud brick walls of their homes. So the villagers chopped the wood up and used it as firewood. In other words, our failure to pay attention to what people truly needed meant American development dollars literally went up in smoke. But when poor people are put in charge of their own development, we can have a tangible, positive impact on their lives. By contrast, another success story in Afghanistan is what is called the National Solidarity Program. In 2003, this program gave rural villages ownership over their own economic development. One village in Afghanistan, Dadi Khel, is in the mountains near the Pakistani border, where the Taliban insurgents were recruiting economically isolated villagers. As part of the National Solidarity Program, villagers chose to build their own hydropower plant that will bring electricity to about 300 families. The villagers record government aid disbursements for the entire community to see in a very transparent manner, reinforcing the relationship between citizens and their government. What's more, the Taliban feels less comfortable attacking village-led projects than it does clearly branded foreign aid initiatives. A second critical principle to a new national development strategy is choosing the right benchmarks for success. When measuring results, we need a field perspective that looks at development outcomes, not a bean-counting, box-checking Washington perspective that only tallies inputs and outputs. But within that framework, we'll also have some important decisions to make about whether the outcomes we seek should be immediate or long-term. Do we, for example, choose to meet the needs of vulnerable populations for vital goods and services today? This is the thrust, for example, of the current programs like PEPFAR, or what is the acronym for the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, through which the United States provides life-extending antiretroviral treatments that have enabled some 2.4 million individuals with HIV to reclaim their futures. Or do we invest in building more durable capacity of states, citizens, and markets to deliver outcomes over time, like promoting educational and preventive healthcare systems that could help shield people from getting diseases like HIV in the first place? Today, America increasingly chooses the quick win. I think we do that in part because, as Americans, we are impatient for results. We have a business sector that lives and dies by the logic of quarterly returns. Our high-tech sector runs on creative overdrive, always looking for the new thing. And even Joan Kroc acquired a fortune thanks to our appetite for fast food. But when it comes to development, our concern with speed and output is undermining our ability to take a long view and get durable results. So as we ask ourselves the tough questions about where taxpayers' dollars are best spent, and as we confront the ethical dilemmas inherent in some of these choices, we have to keep our eyes on the prize and ensure that our tactics are in line with our strategic aim, which is fighting poverty and helping others help themselves. The third and final principle of a national strategy can be summarized as ownership, giving those we are trying to help the reins of their own development. Because as much as we like to think otherwise, we can't develop people or countries. We can give them some tools, we can give them some incentives, but they actually have to develop themselves. In practice, the ownership concept begins by transferring information to recipient governments and citizens. Predictable, transparent information about how much aid money there is, who's it coming from, and where is it going. Now this sounds grotesquely obvious, and none of us here could manage our own organizations or our own households if we never knew how much money we had in the bank or who had access to that account. But in recent studies that we've done as Oxfam, we found that the government, for example, of Afghanistan has no idea how 1/3 of all U.S. aid has been spent since 2001, which amounts to some $5 billion. In Uganda, a mapping exercise in 2005 found twice as much aid being spent as what the government was told. The government of Sierra Leone knows little about 265 different aid projects that donors are funding in its own country. So if governments don't know what's going on in their own countries, they can't be effective and they can't be responsible, or even accountable for that matter. They can't plan or manage their poverty alleviation programs or explain to their populations what exactly is going on or what they're in fact doing. Meanwhile, citizens can't hold their governments accountable for progress. This has to change. It has to change so that aid recipients have an ownership stake in their own development within their own countries. Second, ownership means transferring capacity to recipient governments and citizens. Now, some U.S. assistance for capacity building has already worked quite well. USAID has helped the El Salvador's Legislative Assembly emerge as an independent institution. It's facilitated important public hearings in Mozambique and supported the rebuilding of Afghanistan's Ministry of Finance and Central Bank, just to give a few examples of the kind of institutional investment and capacity that we can take some credit for. But the fact is we're spending 1 out of every 3 U.S. aid dollars on technical cooperation. And given the scale of that investment, we ought to have more to show for our efforts. Why don't we? One reason is because USAID is required by law to hire American contractors who often cost 15% to 30% more than local contractors from the recipient country, even though the goods and services that they receive aren't necessarily any better. The opportunity cost is also too high. Tying aid in this way keeps local contractors from using resources that would otherwise develop their own capacity and generate economic opportunity within their own countries or their own communities. The way to fix this problem is to give our development professionals more discretion in solving challenges on the ground, at the coalface, if you will. If a U.S. consultant knows more about the problem, speaks the language, and can get the job done, then USAID should have the power to hire her. But if she is being hired and charges more simply because she understands the U.S. aid machine, then, Houston, we have a problem. Finally, to promote ownership as a part of an effective national strategy for global development, we need to transfer control to recipient governments and citizens. Members of Congress and U.S. officials overseeing foreign assistance are often afraid of handing over the keys. But when we weigh down our aid with inflexible earmarks and directives, we send the message to aid workers that Washington officials don't trust them to do their jobs. And to recipient countries, we send the message that they can't be trusted to know what's best for their own institutions and communities. If the ultimate goal of our development assistance is to put ourselves out of business, it's hard to see how this strategy can lead to success. Oxfam believes we ought to be sending a message of partnership instead. At a minimum, we should limit earmarks and presidential initiatives that are inconsistent with country priorities. But to lead with best practice, we should increase budget support for development purposes to responsible governments and let them determine where our limited dollars might be best applied. Now, I've talked a lot about problems tonight, but let me spend a moment on success. Early in my career, I lived in Bangladesh in the early 90s, and I saw firsthand that what good can come from the kind of approach that I'm talking about. You might recall that as recently as 40 years ago, the country that is now Bangladesh was actually East Pakistan. It was one of the poorest and most unstable regions in the world. In 1971, a civil war broke out in Pakistan that resulted in the birth of Bangladesh as a nation. In the aftermath of that conflict, Henry Kissinger memorably described Bangladesh as the world's basket case. Well, he was, at that time, right. Bangladesh had seen more than 2 million people killed in its fight to become an independent state. Some 2.5 million people fled as refugees into neighboring India. There was a massive number of internally displaced persons. The nation's physical, social, and agricultural infrastructure couldn't support its exploding population. Political unrest persisted amid 3 years of famines and post-war devastation. Fast forward to the present. You no longer hear about famines in Bangladesh because over the years, USAID worked with Bangladeshis to build domestic agricultural institutions to contend with the nation's long-term food security challenges. You no longer hear about the devastating effects of overpopulation in Bangladesh because USAID helped build capacity in the government and NGO sectors to support long-term family planning programs and maternal child health programs. You no longer hear about a deficient civil society because USAID in Bangladesh invested heavily in Bangladesh's efforts to build one of the most innovative NGO sectors in the world. And as a result of these and other efforts, you seldom hear about the kind of sectarian violence and instability that I might add continue to plague modern-day Pakistan. In fact, research shows that while Pakistan and Bangladesh continue to face enormous challenges in terms of poverty, economic growth, and governance, Bangladesh has managed to outperform Pakistan on a number of key social indicators. Compared to Bangladesh, women in Pakistan have twice as many children, and under-5 mortality is 30% higher. Now, comparing the progress of different societies and different cultures is not a clean science. Nonetheless, I think this broadly reminds us what works and what doesn't in foreign assistance. Meanwhile, our failed efforts in Pakistan, we've spent $10 billion in Pakistan on aid since over the last decade. Our failed efforts in Pakistan, driven largely by security concerns, demonstrate the need for reform. Our successful efforts in Bangladesh, driven by our desire to help the Bangladeshi people chart a course of their own development over the long term, demonstrates something altogether different. That if we have the right priorities and the right approach, American foreign assistance can alleviate global poverty and can contribute to global stability. And at Oxfam, we believe there's a real yearning in America to do this kind of work, to engage this challenge, to play this constructive role on the world stage, and to act on the positive values we hold as a nation and as individuals. Last month, as many of you are probably aware, despite a prolonged recession and historic unemployment here in the United States, American families donated something on the order of $720 million to the relief and recovery effort in Haiti. At Oxfam, our phones were buzzing off the hook, and we received a record number of contributions online. Opinion research on support for foreign aid has consistently revealed that the American people believe that fighting global poverty is a national and moral imperative. And they consistently think that we give more than we do. So, as a nation, we want to give more aid, and we're comfortable with the idea of giving much more than we do. But it isn't a question of spending more money, it's a question of getting better results for the money we spend. Results that truly reflect the American public's genuine desire to help. For far too long, we've settled for far too little return on our efforts. And what I'd like to see is that we repair this disconnect between our values and our actions. And I believe we stand at a crucial moment for getting it right. Since 9/11, our country has grappled with how to engage in the world. We made some choices over the past 10 years that have left us less secure instead of more secure, and that caused our international standing in the world to plummet, even among close allies. In nations like Indonesia and Turkey, U.S. approval ratings have plummeted from 75% before 9/11 to 15% today. That despite the enthusiasm for President Obama's election. Now, as the new administration tries to reframe American engagement with the world, we should make the most of the role effective aid can play in extending our hand, expressing our values, leading by example, reminding the world what our nation stands for, not what it stands against. We have a chance to implement this new outlook right away in another desperately needy country, our hemispheric neighbor, Haiti. Imagine a Haiti where our development efforts begin with a genuine dialogue that empowers the Haitian people and those parts of the Haitian government with a demonstrated commitment to development to own their own renewal. Imagine a Haiti where instead of solutions imposed by a distant Washington development process, they are driven instead by the needs of people that we aspire to help. Imagine a Haiti where we provide the country transparent and predictable information about our aid, facilitating greater accountability between the Haitian government, Haitian citizens, and between all Haitians and the U.S. government. Imagine a Haiti where our incredible resources work in concert to rescue Haitians not only from the ruins of the earthquake, but also from the unjust systems that have trapped them in poverty for decades. As I said at the outset, poverty is about powerlessness, but I believe this is a powerful vision for Haiti's future, for a new kind of U.S. aid, and for America's role in building a more peaceful world. And it won't be easy. Many of Haiti's institutions were weak before the quake, and now they've literally been devastated. But we have an opportunity to start in this new direction with one of our closest neighbors, an historic opportunity to get it right. Oxfam will continue to champion this vision in Washington and beyond. The political constellations are aligned, but it will require political will and citizen engagement to get the job done and get it done right. So I hope that you will all find a way to join in this great endeavor. As you well know, the Institute and the Catholic teaching at its core understands that peace and justice are two sides of the same coin. And if we all are to realize Joan Kroc's dream to not only talk about peace, but to make peace, then you have to help make social justice a reality for the global poor as well. So I look to you as humanitarians, scholars, students, and citizens of deep compassion to help reconnect our foreign assistance to our greatest domestic ideals. Let's bridge the divide between our values and our actions, between our development inputs and outcomes, and make a difference in the world we share, for the poor and for ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now it's that time. That was very, very impressive for those of us who are devoted in the way that you are to making this kind of change in our world. So for those of you who have questions, please know that there'll be someone to pick them up from you. There are people wandering the audiences, and we'll get those up here and get your questions. But there's always this moment when we don't have the questions yet, when somebody who gets to do the question and answer period with our guest gets to ask their own questions. So you talked about the 3D orientation, development, defense, and diplomacy. And I'm wondering whether or not Oxfam has developed a relation that may not be so formalized as going through Washington, but for example, in Haiti with the military, do you have some kind of contact? Because I know there has to be a lot of logistical cooperation for the kind of work that you do on the ground. Have you formed a relationship with any of those areas, the military, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, let me be very, very clear about the way we think about how these 3Ds should operate and interact with one another. First of all, let me be very, very clear. My remarks tonight are in no way an indictment of the U.S. defense establishment or the military per se. What we're talking about here is rebalancing the way these various components of our policy establishment interact with one another and how they might complement one another more effectively. And I think there's probably no better example of how this works than in these challenging humanitarian environments. The tsunami is one example where the U.S. military played a very important role in providing lift capacity to get supplies into Aceh in Indonesia, into areas that were very, very hard to reach. In Haiti, Oxfam has a very direct relationship with the U.S. military because one of the major areas where we're providing assistance is on a 9-acre golf course in an area on the outskirts of downtown Port-au-Prince, which was basically the golf course of the Haitian elite, which, when the earthquake occurred, the walls fell down, and the population around it, whose houses had collapsed, moved into this open space. And there are now 70,000 people living there in tents on a 9-acre golf course. And it turns out the U.S. ambassador's residence and the Canadian ambassador's residence are on either side of this property, or this golf course. And in order to secure the property, the U.S. Embassy decided to work out an arrangement with the owners of the golf course to basically rent the property during the period of this humanitarian process, and posted 400 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne on the perimeter. And we are basically providing water and sanitation facilities to these 70,000 people, collaborating directly with the 82nd Airborne in this situation. Their role actually has been to provide security when we've done food deliveries on site in those early days when people were desperate for food and people were just scrambling to get at whatever food was available. Basically, we organized a delivery program where we only delivered food to women in a very orderly way, and the 82nd Airborne collaborated in helping to keep order as that food delivery went forward. And that happened all over Port-au-Prince with both UN troops and the U.S. military. So in these situations, the U.S. international humanitarian law provides very clarity about what the role of military should be in these situations. And in case after case, the Indonesian case being one, in the tsunami, and this one being another, there is collaboration in situations where we need security and we need lift capacity from the U.S. military. I would also say that when you are out around the city of Port-au-Prince, you don't see the U.S. military running patrols. They are actually operating within a very narrow humanitarian mission, and basically trying to provide security to enable the humanitarian process to be effectively executed. That's the role that they're playing, and they're doing a very impressive and effective job.
And we'll close with this one then. From being out there in the world and having local people do their things, we'll do it locally here. The question is, what's the single concrete way that American citizens can help affect the change in policy, particularly the orientation of really having a strategic plan, of setting policies? What can we do?
Great. That was a great setup. I want to close with that one. Okay. Are you ready? Here's the action plan. I mentioned that there's a lot of momentum in Washington for reform, and I can be a little bit more concrete. Howard Berman succeeded Tom Lantos as chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and when Howard Berman took that position, I and a couple of other people met with him, and we actually challenged him to embrace this idea. And this was during the primaries prior to the major national election. And our argument was, this was a real historic opportunity. There was a real debate going on in Washington about smart power and the use of diplomacy and development to complement, the more military approach that we'd taken to our foreign policy over the last 10 years. And he basically decided that he was going to make this one of his 4 or 5 priorities while he's chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And so he's really embraced this, and he has put a bill on the floor of the House of Representatives. So there is actually a bill that he's put forward already to initiate this reform process. And he put it forward in some sense to signal the Obama administration that he was dead serious and that he wanted to take action on this. And so, and also to signal the State Department that he wanted to take action on it, and he wanted that bill to embody many of the concerns and principles that I spoke to in my remarks. That actually triggered action on the Senate side, and initiated by Richard Lugar, on the Republican side. I mean, I want to emphasize this is actually not a partisan issue. It is a bipartisan concern, one of the few in Washington these days, where there's some shared interest on both sides of the aisle. And so Richard Lugar pressured John Kerry, who's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, to actually introduce a bill on that side. So now we have a bill in the House, we have a bill in the Senate. That then precipitated action in the State Department and the White House. And what's going on in the State Department and the White House is the State Department has initiated something called the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which is the first time the State Department has actually attempted to undertake a major strategic review of all of its policy and to sort of set a 5-year kind of frame for its work. This is done routinely in the Defense Department under something called the Quadrennial Defense Review. And the State Department has now tried to embrace that concept. So that process is going on right now. That report is issuing interim recommendations in the next month or so. And then that precipitated the White House to do something called a Presidential Study Directive, or PSD they call it. And that actually is a document recommending to the President what action should be taken to initiate this reform process. So that's what I mean when I say pigs are flying in Washington these days, because this is all of this going on, and all of it being aligned in terms of the core principles I've talked about is really quite substantial. So the process that we expect to see happen is the State Department will issue its interim recommendations. They will be incorporated into the Presidential Study Directive, which goes to the President's desk. Then we need a statement from the President that he wants to do in effect what President Kennedy did in 1961, which is make a major speech on development and development reform. And the House and Senate are basically, their staff are waiting for the output from the White House and the State Department to incorporate this new thinking into their bills, so their bills that go forward actually incorporate all this new reform thinking. So our hope is that we can actually get this done. We're now going to go into an election cycle, as you all know, and so that things are going to sort of slow down a bit. But it will give, the hope is that we will get the bills issued on the floor before we go into the election cycle, so they'll be under review and that they'll be up for vote sometime later this year. So that's maybe more than you wanted to know. But what I would suggest is that if you want to reach out to your congressperson here in San Diego, I'm not sure who that is, but you will.
We have one good one on your side.
Okay. Well, as I said, it's a bipartisan issue, so you can reach out on both sides of the aisle and remind them that Richard Lugar is very much supportive of this, and we've got actually to say in the Senate it's Lugar, Corker, Menendez, and Kerry are actually sponsoring the bill. And there's, I think there's like 20 signatories to the House bill. So, so there's a lot of initial support for this. So if you want to be helpful, call your congressman and congressperson and actually indicate that you're interested in this reform process in Washington. You want to support these bills. We can provide through the Institute the numbers of those bills, and you can track them as they course their way through the Congress in the coming year. So thank you all very, very much for a very pleasant evening.